For more than half a century, the historian Dr. Yosef Ben-Jochannan asked a deceptively simple question: who built the civilization of the Nile, and how long ago? Known to his students and audiences as Dr. Ben, he spent his life arguing that ancient Egypt, which its own people called Kemet and Ta-Merry, was an indigenous African achievement, the daughter of older cultures rising further south along the river. In a series of reference works on chronology, he laid the dynasties of the Nile Valley side by side, compared the ancient priest Manetho against the modern European Egyptologists, and challenged his readers to weigh the dates for themselves. This program follows the argument of one of those works, presenting his case, his evidence, and the debates that surround it. At the heart of Ben-Jochannan's life work stands a single claim: that Africa is the cradle of human civilization, and that the high culture of the Nile Valley grew from African roots, not foreign ones. The people of Kemet, he argued, were indigenous Africans, dark-skinned descendants of older peoples who had migrated north from the Great Lakes region and the lands of Ta-Nehisi, ancient Nubia. Civilization, in his telling, flowed downstream from the interior of the continent toward the Mediterranean, long before Greece or Rome were born. This was not, he insisted, a matter of racial pride alone, but of evidence, of monuments, of king lists, of language, of religion, and above all, of chronology. To know who built a civilization, he taught, you must first know when, and the question of dates would become the spine of his case. Before the argument, the man, a teacher who carried thousands of students up the Nile to read the evidence in stone, and who made the chronology of Africa his life's work. Yosef Alfredo Antonio Ben-Jochannan was born in the early 20th century in the Caribbean, of mixed Ethiopian and Puerto Rican heritage, and came to make his home and his name in Harlem, New York. Trained, by his own account, in engineering before turning to history, he became one of the central figures of the movement known as Afrocentric, or African-centered scholarship. For decades, he lectured at Cornell, at City College, and in community halls and churches across the United States, drawing crowds far beyond the university. He is remembered above all for the study tours he led to Egypt and the Nile Valley, walking visitors through temples and tombs so they might judge the monuments with their own eyes. He wrote and self-published dozens of books, and he insisted always that history be read at the source, rather than received secondhand. Ben-Jochannan framed his work as a corrective. Generations of students, he argued, had been taught a history that began in Greece and erased Africa from the human story, or that treated the people of ancient Egypt as anything but African. His mission was to restore what he called the indigenous African to the center of a history he had built. He wrote for the general reader as much as for the specialist, and he wrote with open passion, naming what he saw as the racism and religious bias embedded in the way Egypt had been presented to the world. Critics would later fault that passion and some of his sources. Supporters answered that he forced open questions the Academy had long preferred to keep closed. Either way, his stated aim was constant: to return African people to a place in their own past. To see Egypt as its builder saw it, Ben-Jochannan urged, begin with the names they used for their own land and with the river that made it possible. Ben-Jochannan was insistent that the word Egypt is a foreign label, given much later by the Greeks. The people who built the civilization, he wrote, called their country by their own names: Ta-Merry, the beloved land, and Kemet, a word he and many others read as the Black Land, or the land of the black people. To the south lay Ta-Nehisi, the land he identified with Nubia and Kush, and beyond it Ethiopia, or Ethiopia, Puanit, or Punt, and Libu, ancient Libya. These were not separate worlds in his reading, but a single corridor of related African high cultures strung along the Blue and White Nile, the Atbara, and back toward the Great Lakes. To call the whole region merely Egypt, he argued, was already to lose its African meaning and to cut it off from the lands that gave it birth. Everything in Ben-Jochannan's chronology turns on the Nile. The river rises deep in the African interior, gathers the waters of the Great Lakes and the Ethiopian highlands, and flows north for thousands of miles to the Mediterranean. Each year, its floods spread black silt across the valley, and from that fertility, he argued, the earliest farmers built the granaries of a civilization. Because the river flows from south to north, he read its history the same way: culture, peoples, and kingship moving downstream, out of the heart of the continent toward the delta. The Nile, in his account, is not merely a setting, but the very artery of African history, binding Ta-Nehisi to Ta-Merry, the highlands to the sea, and making it impossible, he insisted, to study Egypt honestly while ignoring the African lands upstream from which its waters and its people came. Ben-Jochannan's chronology does not begin with the pyramids, but tens of thousands of years earlier in the Stone Age cultures of the Nile and the migrations that preceded the dynasties. Drawing on the periods catalogued in his work, he traced a long descent, the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic along the Nile terraces, then the Neolithic, and a succession of named pre-dynastic cultures, Tasian, Badarian, Amradian, Girzayan, reaching down toward the first kings. The people who carried these cultures, he argued, were Africans moving north out of the Great Lakes region and the lands of Ethiopia and Ta-Nehisi, bringing their tools, their farming, and their beliefs with them. Long before the first dynasty, in his telling, the valley had already been shaped by African hands. The historian's task was to make that deep, pre-dynastic African foundation visible beneath the famous monuments. If one idea separates Ben-Jochannan most sharply from older textbooks, it is his reversal of the usual relationship between Egypt and Nubia. The conventional account treated Nubia as a poorer borderland that borrowed from a superior Egypt. Ben-Jochannan argued the opposite direction of influence, that Ta-Nehisi, the land of Nubia and Kush to the south, was older than dynastic Egypt and stood as its parent rather than its imitator. Civilization, in his reading, matured first along the upper Nile and moved downstream into the valley. He pointed to the southern origin of so many dynasties, recorded in his own king lists, as evidence that the impulse of kingship came from the interior. The Kushites and the Egyptians, he insisted, were one African people of the same stock, and to understand Egypt, one had first to understand the African South that came before it. Here, the book sets its central problem in plain sight, a chart of dynasties where the great European authorities cannot agree with one another, or with the ancient priest who first wrote the list. The framework everyone still uses, Ben-Jochannan reminds his readers, was the work of an African. Around 280 before the Common Era, an Egyptian high priest named Manetho of Sebennytus compiled a history of his country and divided its kings into the dynasties, the numbered houses, that scholars recite to this day. Manetho wrote in Greek, drawing on temple records now lost, and grouped the reigns from the first dynasty onward into a long succession of ruling families. Ben-Jochannan's point is pointed. The very skeleton of Egyptian history, the dynastic system itself, was created not by a modern European, but by an indigenous African priest with access to native sources. If we keep Manetho's structure, he asks, on what grounds do we so freely discard his dates? The question frames everything that follows in his chronology. The centerpiece of the book is a single confrontational chart. Across its columns, Ben-Jochannan sets the dates assigned to each dynasty by the leading 19th century European Egyptologists, Champollion-Figeac, Lepsius, Brugsch, Mariette, alongside the figures derived from Manetho. The result, he argues, is not quiet consensus, but open chaos. For the very same first dynasty, one authority offers a date thousands of years apart from another. The columns are studded with question marks where the experts simply do not know. We continue, he writes, to call these scholars authorities on the facts of Egyptology, yet they cannot agree among themselves on the most basic measure of all, when the kingdoms began. The chart is his exhibit for the prosecution, a demonstration that the modern dating of Egypt is far less settled than it is made to appear. From that disagreement, Ben-Jochannan draws a deliberately provocative conclusion. If the modern authorities cannot concede Manetho's incorrectness by first agreeing on their own correctness, he reasons, on what basis should we desert him, the original creator of the dynastic system, in favor of them? Lacking any single set of European figures that can be followed with confidence, he announces that he will instead accept the ancient priest's conclusions and use his calculations, anchoring his timeline to roughly 4100 before the Common Era for what he calls Nile Year 1. He invites the reader to check his pharaoh list against all the others for accuracy and completeness. Whether or not one accepts so early a date, his method is clear. Where the experts fracture, he returns to the oldest indigenous source and builds from there. Ben-Jochannan reminds his readers that the people of the Nile did not count years as we do. Their calendar, he writes, ran on the Nile year, a solar year of 365 and a quarter days, at least a quarter day longer than the year of the modern Western calendar. He calls these the Masonical calculations of the ancient indigenous Africans, tied to the rising of the river and the stars, and notes that our present system was imposed only centuries later under the Roman Emperor Justinian, replacing the older African reckoning. Part of his chronological argument is precisely this, that to translate Egyptian history into modern dates is already to convert it out of its own framework. The historian, he suggests, must respect the calendar a civilization actually kept, not silently overwrite it with another. With his framework set, Ben-Jochannan walks the long line of kings, reading the dynasties as the story of an African kingship that, again and again, rose from the south. When Ben-Jochannan lists the earliest dynasties, he marks again and again the same direction of origin, from the south. The first dynasty, he records, came from Thebes or from Ta-Nehisi, the Nubian lands upriver, and its founding king he names as Aha, identified with Narmer and with the Menes of later tradition, the ruler credited with uniting the two lands. The second and third dynasties he likewise traces to the south, to Tiny and to Memphis. This southern origin is central to his case. The impulse to kingship and unity, he argues, did not arrive from Asia or Europe, but rose from deeper in Africa and moved north with the river. The very pattern of the king lists in his reading records a civilization being assembled from its African interior outward toward the sea. In Ben-Jochannan's chronology, the 3rd through 6th dynasties form what he calls the Great Pyramid Age, the era of the Old Kingdom. Here stand the builders whose names survive in stone: Djoser, for whom he records the first great step structure, and in the 4th dynasty, Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, the pharaohs of the colossal pyramids and the Sphinx at Giza. He notes their reigns continuing as the pyramid builders of the 5th and 6th dynasties as well. For Ben-Jochannan, these monuments are evidence in the most literal sense, the work of indigenous African engineers and laborers, raised by a native civilization at the height of its powers. The pyramids, in his account, are not a mystery imported from elsewhere, but the achievement of the African people whose kings the lists name, line after line. Among the monuments Ben-Jochannan returned to most often was the Great Sphinx of Giza, which he read as a witness in stone to the African identity of Kemet. On his study tours, he would draw visitors' attention to its features, arguing that the broad nose and full lips of the colossal face were those of an African, and recalling that earlier travelers, including Europeans, had remarked on the same Negroid character before the question became politically charged. The damage to the Sphinx's face he treated as part of the story, a defacement he linked to the discomfort of those who could not accept an African monument of such grandeur. Whether or not one follows every detail, his larger point stands as a method. Read the monuments themselves as evidence, and let the faces the ancient sculptors carved testify to the people who built and ruled the valley. Ben-Jochannan's chronology is careful to mark when the rulers of the Nile were not African. After the Middle Kingdom, he records the arrival of the Hyksos, whom he describes as the first Asian rulers in Africa, invaders who entered from a nomadic life in Asia and held the 15th through 17th dynasties. He treats this as an occupation, a foreign interruption later thrown off when native kings rose once more from Thebes in the south to drive the invaders out and open the new kingdom. This distinction matters for his larger argument. By labeling each dynasty as African or foreign, from Asia or from Europe, he builds a ledger of who actually ruled, insisting that the long native African story can be told apart from the episodes of conquest that interrupted it. The land, in his framing, was repeatedly invaded, but remained, in origin, African. The New Kingdom, the 18th through 20th dynasties, is in Ben-Jochannan's account the age of African empire restored. From Thebes, kings he lists as Ahmose, Amenhotep, and the Thutmose line expelled the Hyksos and pushed the borders of Ta-Merry outward in every direction. Among them, he names the woman who ruled as pharaoh, Hatshepsut, and the warrior kings whose monuments still crowd Luxor and Karnak. This is the period of the Great Temples, of empire reaching south into Nubia and east into Asia, and of the famous names, Ramesses among them, that even popular memory retains. For Ben-Jochannan, the New Kingdom is proof of African power at its height, a native dynasty that, having cast out foreign rule, built one of the ancient world's mightiest states and stamped its achievement across the monuments of the Nile. Ben-Jochannan placed great weight on the written record of Kemet, the hieroglyphic inscriptions through which the Africans of the Nile set down their own history. The king lists he reproduced were filled with names rendered in their original signs, the cartouches of pharaohs reaching back to the first dynasty, evidence that this was a literate civilization keeping its own annals. He reminded readers that Manetho himself had drawn on such temple archives, and he treated the surviving inscriptions, the Palermo stone, the temple king lists, the monument walls, as primary testimony from the people themselves, rather than the interpretations of later outsiders. For Ben-Jochannan, the lesson was that Kemet need not be explained only through foreign eyes. The Africans of the valley had left a vast written record, and the historian's first duty was to read what they themselves had carved. One chapter of the Chronology Ben-Jochannan dwells on with evident pride, the 25th dynasty, when kings from the south ruled the whole of the Nile. From Ethiopia and Ta-Nehisi, he records, came Kashta and Pianki, then Shabaka, Shabbataka, Taharka, and Tanwedamani, the Kushite or Nubian pharaohs who governed both their own land and Egypt itself. For Ben-Jochannan, this is the argument made flesh. The Kushites, he stresses, were as black as any other indigenous African, and their reign over Egypt demonstrates that the civilization of the Nile was a continuous African world in which power could flow north from Nubia and be recognized as legitimate kingship. The southern lands, so often treated as a mere borderland, here stand revealed in his telling as a heartland from which pharaohs came. Ben-Jochannan's chronology ends the age of native kingship with a sequence of invaders, each carefully labeled by origin. The Persians come twice from Asia, holding the 27th and the 31st dynasties. Then, in 332 before the Common Era, the Macedonian Greeks arrive under Alexander, opening the line of the Ptolemies, Europeans, he notes pointedly, ruling Africa, down to the last queen, Cleopatra. After them come the Romans, whose long colonial rule he files under a so-called dynasty of emperors and governors. He marks Cleopatra and her house as the close of foreign Greek rule, and the Ptolemies as the last royal line before Rome, and he treats the whole Greco-Roman period as conquest and colonization, rather than native achievement. The story he set out to tell, of indigenous African kingship along the Nile, here reaches its end. Beyond kings and dates, Ben-Jochannan turned to the inner life of Kemet, its gods and its wisdom, and made some of his most debated claims about where later religions came from. Ben-Jochannan devoted much of his writing to the religion of the Nile Valley, which he placed among the oldest organized spiritual systems on Earth. He wrote of the great divine figures, Ra the sun, Osiris and Isis, Horus and the company of gods, and traced their worship back through the chronology to a date he reckoned near 4100 before the Common Era. Behind the many gods and goddesses, he was careful to argue, the Africans of the Nile held a conception of a single supreme power above all others, named in their texts as the I Am and the Unseen One. He resisted the idea that theirs was mere primitive idolatry. In his reading, the religion of Kemet was a developed theology with its own account of creation, judgment, and the soul, worked out by African priests long before the religions that would later dominate the world. Among Ben-Jochannan's most influential and most contested arguments is his account of the Egyptian mystery system. The temples of Kemet, he taught, were not only places of worship, but schools, training their initiates over long years in what we would call philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and ethics. This African wisdom tradition, he argued, was the true ancestor of much that the world later credited to Greece. He pointed to the long-recognized tradition that Greek thinkers, Pythagoras, Thales, and others, had traveled to Egypt to study, and he pressed the claim far further than most academic historians would. The mystery system became, in his hands, the original university of the ancient world. Mainstream scholarship treats parts of this picture as overstated. For Ben-Jochannan, it was central, a way of locating the origins of knowledge itself in Africa. The source chronology lays Egyptian history beside the dates of biblical figures, and Ben-Jochannan used such comparisons to advance one of his boldest themes, that the roots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam reach back into the religion of the Nile. In his charts, the patriarchs and prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, and Solomon, are each placed against a corresponding Egyptian dynasty and pharaoh. He argued that ideas the West treats as uniquely its own, a creator who declares "I am," a judgment of the soul, a moral law, had African precedents along the Nile. This is among the most disputed parts of his work, challenged by many historians and theologians, yet it followed directly from his method. By synchronizing the timelines, he sought to show that the religions of the book inherited from an older African world. Ben-Jochannan did not argue alone, nor without opposition. His case belonged to a wider movement, and it met a wider resistance. Ben-Jochannan's arguments ran parallel to those of the Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop, the most rigorously credentialed champion of an African ancient Egypt. Where Ben-Jochannan worked as a popular historian and teacher, Diop brought the tools of the laboratory, studies of skin pigmentation in mummified remains, analysis of language and culture, and an appeal to the testimony of ancient writers. At a now famous 1974 UNESCO symposium in Cairo, Diop and his colleague Théophile Obenga pressed the case for a Black African Egypt before an assembly of international Egyptologists. Diop's work gave the movement a foundation in evidence critics could not easily dismiss. By different routes, the two men advanced the same proposition Ben-Jochannan made his life's cause, that the builders of Kemet were African, and that their civilization belonged to the history of Black people. A favorite line of argument for Ben-Jochannan and for Diop before the UNESCO Assembly drew on the testimony of the ancient writers themselves. The Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled in Egypt in the 5th century before the Common Era, described its people as dark-skinned and woolly-haired, and judged that the inhabitants of Egypt and of distant Colchis shared a common origin. Other classical authors spoke in similar terms, and the Greeks freely acknowledged their debt to Egyptian learning. For Ben-Jochannan, such ancient testimony carried special force, precisely because it came from the very Europeans whose heirs would later deny it. If the Greeks, who saw Egypt with their own eyes, called its people black and studied at its temples, he asked, by what authority do modern scholars overrule them? The ancients, in his reading, had answered the question of Egypt's identity long ago. At the center of the controversy lies the question of how to describe the color and identity of the ancient Egyptians, and here Ben-Jochannan was unambiguous. The indigenous people of Kemet, he wrote, were black, with the features, the woolly hair and dark skin and broad noses that European scholars had so often used to set Africans apart. He charged that prejudice, the bias of European, British, and American academicians against people whose appearance was the opposite of their own, had driven the refusal to call ancient Egypt African. Mainstream Egyptology generally responds that the ancient population was diverse and that modern racial categories fit the ancient world poorly. Ben-Jochannan rejected what he saw as evasion. For him, the evidence of the monuments and the testimony of the ancients pointed plainly towards an Africa whose great civilization was built by black hands. Honesty requires setting Ben-Jochannan's case beside the serious objections it has drawn. Academic Egyptologists have questioned some of his dates as far too early, criticized his use of sources, and rejected the sweeping claim that Greek philosophy was simply stolen from Egypt. They argue that ancient identities cannot be mapped onto modern ideas of race, and that parts of his reconstruction outrun the evidence. Ben-Jochannan, for his part, regarded much of this resistance as the very bias he had set out to expose, and he answered that the experts' own disagreements, written plainly across their dating charts, undercut their claim to certainty. A documentary treatment need not settle the dispute. It is enough to set the two sides clearly side by side, a passionate revisionist case and a scholarly establishment that contests much of it. Whatever the verdict on its particulars, Ben-Jochannan's work left a lasting mark on how a generation thought about Africa, history, and themselves. Ben-Jochannan's deepest legacy may lie less in any single date than in a habit of mind he taught a generation to look south, toward Africa, when asking where civilization began. Through his books, his lectures, and above all, the study tours that placed students before the monuments themselves, he gave countless people a sense of ownership over the ancient past. He helped shape the African-centered current in education, inspiring teachers, writers, and curricula that placed Africa at the heart of the human story, rather than its margins. His insistence that history be read at the source and that the people of Kemet be recognized as African reached far beyond the academy into popular culture and community life. For many, encountering his work was the first time the history of the Nile had been offered to them as their own inheritance. Ben-Jochannan poured his argument into a long shelf of books, many of them written and published outside the commercial mainstream, so that they would reach the readers he cared about most. Titles such as Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, Black Man of the Nile and His Family, and the chronological reference works on the dynasties of the Nile Valley became staples of community bookstores, study circles, and home libraries. They were dense with charts, king lists, maps, and citations, built as much to be consulted as to be read straight through. The chronology at the heart of this program is one such work, less a narrative than a tool, designed to let any reader lay the dynasties side by side and judge the dates. Through these volumes, his arguments outlived his lectures, passing into the hands of readers who would never have entered a university seminar. If there is a single discipline Ben-Jochannan pressed on his readers, it is the one his chronology embodies: go to the source and compare. He would not let students rest on a textbook's confident dates. He set the authorities against one another and against the ancient priest, and asked which could actually be trusted. He returned wherever he could to the monuments, the king lists, and the oldest records, rather than to second-hand summaries. This method, more than any particular conclusion, is what his admirers carry forward: a refusal to accept received history without examining its foundations, and an insistence that the African evidence be weighed directly. Even readers who reject his answers can learn from the question he never stopped asking: who says so? On what evidence? And measured against which other accounts? More than a generation on, the debate Ben-Jochannan helped ignite has not gone quiet. The question of how to understand ancient Egypt as an African civilization, a Mediterranean one, or something that resists our categories entirely remains genuinely contested, and discoveries continue to refine the picture. What endures from his work is the demand that Africa be taken seriously as a maker of civilization, and that the chronology of the continent be studied on its own terms rather than as a footnote to Europe. His specific dates may be challenged, and some of his claims set aside, yet the larger questions he forced into the open about origins, evidence, and who is allowed to claim the ancient past are still being argued today. That perhaps is the truest measure of a historian's influence. We have followed Dr. Yosef Ben-Jochannan from the names a people gave their own land, through the war over the dates and the ancient priest Manetho, down the long line of African dynasties, into the religion and the mysteries of Kemet, and out to the great debate over race, evidence, and origins that his work helped to ignite. He asked us to look south, to read history at the source, and to recognize the builders of the Nile as African. His answers remain contested, and the questions he raised are still alive. If this journey gave you something to think about, share it, subscribe, and like, so more of these voices reach the light. Until next time, keep studying the chronology of Africa and weighing the evidence for yourself.